Before there was money, there was a promise, not a coin, not a note. Just a simple understanding that something given today would be returned tomorrow. That understanding became the invisible thread that tied strangers, villages, and entire civilizations together. It was older than gold, older than trade, older even than written language. It was the first system of trust humanity ever built, and it was called debt. Welcome to the history of debt, where money, power, and history collide. And where the oldest stories about humanity aren't written in ink but in numbers, etched on clay, sealed with promises, and still echoing through every transaction we make today. Imagine the world around 4000 BCE. There are no coins, no markets, no wallets, just small communities living between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a place we now call Mesopotamia, the land between rivers. Here the first cities were being born: Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, stone and mud brick rising where hunter-gatherers once roamed freely. At the heart of each city stood something sacred: a temple. But it wasn't just a house of worship. It was a storehouse, a court, a bank, and a government rolled into one. Inside its walls, the priests didn't just speak to gods. They kept ledgers. In those ledgers, they recorded debts. How much grain a farmer owed after a poor harvest, how many sheep a merchant borrowed for trade, how much silver a craftsman would return once his tools were sold. These weren't casual notes, they were the earliest contracts humanity ever made. Every transaction was measured in barley, the currency of survival. If a farmer took 10 measures of grain to feed his family, he'd owe 12 back after the harvest. That extra 2 wasn't interest in the modern sense. It was the cost of trust. The first interest rate in history, written in grain. These temple records, etched on clay tablets, were the first balance sheets. They told the story not just of trade, but of obligation, of human interdependence. In a world before coins, value didn't live in your hands. It lived in your word. Before writing came language, came debt. The first symbols humanity ever carved were not poetry or myth. They were accounting marks. Tiny clay tokens shaped like cones, spheres, and discs. Each one represented something: a goat, a jar of oil, a measure of barley. To keep track of them, people sealed them inside clay envelopes called bulli. When a deal was made, they pressed the token's shape into wet clay on the outside, a permanent record of who owed what to whom. Eventually, they realized they didn't need the tokens anymore. They could just draw the marks. And thus, writing was born, not from art or literature, but from credit. Cuneiform, the world's first script, was a language of accountants. When historians say civilization began in Mesopotamia, what they often mean is that accountability began there. Debt wasn't a flaw. It was the system itself. The first written words on earth didn't praise gods or kings. They said simply, 2 sheep owed to the temple. To understand ancient debt, you have to forget everything you know about money. There were no markets as we think of them today. There was a divine order, and within it, humans owed not just each other, but the gods themselves. The temples were seen as living beings, and every person in the city owed a portion of their labor, their harvest, or their goods to maintain them. This wasn't charity. It was cosmic debt, a repayment to the forces that made life possible. The gods gave fertility, rain, and sunlight. In return, the people gave tribute: barley, cattle, silver, and the priests, as intermediaries, turned that divine exchange into an economic system. You didn't need coins to pay your dues. You paid in kind. What you had, what you made, what you promised. The temple recorded it all. And over time, those promises became standardized. A measure of barley became equivalent to a measure of silver, and from there, value became a universal language. Debt became the heartbeat of society. When farmers planted seeds, they were already in debt to the temple for the grain. When merchants traded abroad, they borrowed from temple reserves. When soldiers went to war, they did so with rations advanced by the state. Debt wasn't personal failure. It was participation in civilization itself. But every system of trust eventually meets its limit. As cities grew, so did inequality. The wealthy, the temple administrators, merchants, and officials, had more to lend, while the poor had only their labor to offer as collateral. If a farmer couldn't repay his grain loan after a bad harvest, his field might be seized, or worse, his children taken as debt servants. For the first time in history, freedom itself became something you could lose over a number. Kings rose and fell over this problem. Some rulers, like Enmetena of Lagash, decreed debt cancellations, a clean slate called amargi, the Sumerian word for freedom. It literally meant return to mother, a poetic description of being freed from bondage and allowed to go home. This practice wasn't moral idealism, it was survival. When too many citizens were enslaved by debt, the economy collapsed. Fields went untended, armies starved, trade stopped. So kings wiped the slate clean, not to show mercy, but to reboot the system. Debt forgiveness was the ancient version of a financial bailout. But the cycle always restarted. As long as debt existed, someone would owe, and someone would own. The numbers carved in clay may have changed, but the power behind them remained the same. Around 2400 BCE, the first recorded credit collapse struck the Sumerian city-states. Temples had extended too many loans. Farmers, burdened by interest and poor harvests, couldn't pay. Merchants hoarded silver instead of lending it. And society, built on trust, began to fracture. Sound familiar? It should. Because this was humanity's first financial crisis, and it looked almost identical to every crisis since. When too much debt builds up in too few hands, the system begins to eat itself. The numbers stop reflecting reality. The ledgers no longer match the lives they represent. Debt, once a tool for cooperation, becomes a weapon of control. The Sumerians didn't call it finance. They called it the law of balance, a principle that said no debt can grow forever. Even the gods, they believed, demanded equilibrium. And when the balance broke, kings reset it, sometimes by decree, sometimes by force, always with the same justification: to restore the world's order. Here's the paradox at the heart of history. Debt built everything we now call civilization. The ziggurats, the canals, the walls of Babylon, all were financed on promises. Laborers worked for rations advanced by temples. Traders borrowed silver to import tin and copper for bronze. Rulers borrowed grain to feed their soldiers. Debt wasn't the shadow side of progress. It was progress. Even when coinage eventually appeared around 600 BCE, it didn't replace credit. It simplified it. Coins were just portable IOUs, stamped by the state, backed by trust. The idea of owing and being owed was already 5,000 years old. When you pay your mortgage, swipe your credit card, or file your taxes, you're not just engaging in modern finance. You're participating in the oldest ritual humanity ever created, the promise that tomorrow you'll make good on today. The Sumerians didn't have our language for economics, but they understood its emotion. To owe was both sacred and shameful, a bond of honor and a source of anxiety. In one ancient proverb, a Sumerian scribe wrote, "The poor man's debt is the wind. It can never be caught." To live meant to owe, to gods, to kings, to one another. Even morality itself was framed in terms of debt. If you wronged someone, you owed restitution. If you prayed to the gods, you offered sacrifice to repay your spiritual balance. This idea spread everywhere. In Hebrew, the same word for debt also means sin. In Christianity, the Lord's Prayer says, "Forgive us our debts." In Islam, debt is so serious that dying indebted is said to delay entry into paradise. What began as a simple record of grain and goats became the architecture of morality, religion, and society itself. Debt shaped not just economies, but consciences. When modern archaeologists unearthed the clay tablets of Uruk and Nippur, they weren't just finding old receipts. They were uncovering humanity's first mirror, a record of how we learned to measure trust. Every civilization since has rewritten the same equation. Trust becomes credit. Credit becomes power. Power demands repayment. And when repayment becomes impossible, the system resets. From Sumer's clay tablets to today's digital ledgers, the code hasn't changed. Only the symbols have. Today, our debts live not in temples, but in servers. The gods we owe are algorithms, not priests. And yet the feeling, the quiet weight of owing something we cannot see, remains exactly the same. When people talk about debt today, they talk about money. But the first debt wasn't about money at all. It was about memory, remembering who gave, who received, and who could be trusted again. That's why the earliest societies survived not through trade, but through networks of mutual obligation. You didn't need wealth to belong. You needed reputation. Debt, in its purest form, wasn't exploitation. It was cooperation extended across time. A way of saying, I believe you'll still be here tomorrow. Civilization, then, wasn't built on stone or bronze. It was built on promises, and in that sense, every society since Sumer has been living on credit, borrowing trust from the future, hoping it never runs out. 5,000 years later, we're still living in the world Sumer built. Our banks, our contracts, our currencies, they're all descendants of those first clay tablets. We still measure worth in numbers and trust in records. We still confuse obligation with morality. And every so often, when the scales tip too far, we call for forgiveness, just as they did. Debt began as a bridge between people. But every bridge casts a shadow. When the promise becomes permanent, when the balance can no longer be restored, that's when civilizations start to crumble. The story of the first debt isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror of now. A reminder that every number on every screen still depends on one fragile human thing: trust. Because before there was money, before there was power, there was the promise. And that promise, once broken or fulfilled, still decides who we are. If this gave you a new way to see history, hit subscribe. The past isn't gone. It's just collecting interest. Welcome to the history of debt.